Hello and welcome back to the Lib Dem Podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in or watching on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're listening to this. We were going to have an episode all about council budgets and the run-up to the local elections here in Britain. However, the world changed last week. And so this week we have our panel, myself, David, Laura and Sam, talking about all the implications from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We were very, very fortunate to have Kira Rudik, who is the leader of the Liberal Holos Party in Ukraine, our sister party to the Lib Dems, talking about how it is on the ground, what her experiences are, what the end game is for this war. I started by asking Kira, who had just had a meeting with Liberal leaders from across Europe, how that meeting went.
It was fantastic. We got great support and we are really thankful for it. So we have right now an ambitious goal for Ukraine to have like a short and simplified procedure to join EU. And we encourage everybody to help us with that because there will be votings in the parliaments very soon. So this is what our aim is. Right now, we see it not only like a huge challenge for Ukrainian people, but like a window of opportunity. First of all, for United Nations to throw away Russia, then to all the other organizations to remove them from councils, from everywhere. Because while people are in shock and while countries are still processing it, it's a good time to do it. We learned it in 2014 when Russia attacked us and we didn't do many things right away. And then it was all buried in the processing, then Russian money, bribing, all that stuff.
How are you? What is it like on the ground? Are you and your family as safe as possibly can be?
So thank you so much for this question. I'm fine. I'm just back from the meetings of the heads of the factions in Ukrainian parliament, which was crazy secure. And we are moving forward. We will do many items that we plan to do, like all the time you plan to do it. And then finally you do it. So to support our army is one thing, but we will do things like taking away Russian banks' properties in Ukraine, etc. So this is a good thing, and it's good that Ukrainian politicians are coming on as one. On a personal level, it's spring in Ukraine. And, as Northern Europe citizens, you know that it's like a huge deal here when things like this happen. And we were waiting for it for a long time, 6 months usually. So it's heartening that these days are actually that complicated. So on a personal level, we didn't have many Air Force attacks today. Oh, but now I hear again like some shootings. But generally for the last 5 days of war, there has been a lot of shooting on the streets, a lot of Air Force attacks, and that when you hear the siren, you need to go down to the bomb shelter. And then they put the army forward and throwing some Russian soldiers at us. So Russian soldiers are easier because we've got our rifles and etc. Rockets are harder because we don't have a good protection system. That's why we are asking all NATO members to help us with an open, the no-fly zone. However, I know that it is a complicated decision and we have been on it all the time. But listen, here is the thing. There is no way for Ukraine to build this system ourselves. I think we all agree. And without the protection from air, we will probably fail. So, number two, nobody wants us to fail. Well, all Russia will be disassembled. So at some point, NATO will still have to come along. And as with the sanctions, my begging to all the country members was just not let it to be too late. Just not let it to be like, okay, here is, let half of you guys die and then we will figure it out. Because with the sanctions, if they were implemented like 2 months ago, and Putin was very adamant about that he's going to attack, both 2 months ago and now, we would probably not have to suffer what we are suffering right now. So for example, the sanctions, the really good ones, were implemented on Friday. So we had 2 days of shooting, and ruble is falling only today. How many Ukrainians died? Like 133 during these 2 days. It may not have been happening, you know.
Yeah.
So on another personal level, we are doing okay. I gathered a resistance group, and we are training. So I just back was seeing my troops training. This is what generals admire.
So, I mean, I just want to kind of take it from your actual journey yourself, because you were a chief operating officer for an IT company. You become an MP in 2019. You then lead your party a year later, and now this. How can you process that change that you've had to go through?
Well, I'm like the general changes. Well, I'm thinking when I'm processing changes, I'm thinking, wow, that will be sound terrific on my biography when it's like 30 years later. No, but you have to accept that you have to accept that things are going to change and just embrace it. It was not easy to change to being a leader of IT company and then to become an MP. But once this opportunity arises, you just have to embrace it. I believe in God, and I think that He's throwing things to my plate for me to digest it, right? So also, like my friend is saying right now, God is making diamonds out of us. So this is the way the challenges make you stronger. And right now, well, I'm very angry. I'm extremely angry. I have like so many different plans for this weekend and for Monday, and I had so many personal plans, and now it's all over. And like the things that I have, it's to train, to go to speak to the world about what's going on, and then to go and hide in bomb shelter. This is not the life that I imagined for myself and my family. And actually, I really want Russia to pay for this.
So that anger that you have towards Russia and how that's going to manifest, because obviously there's peace talks happening right now. Do we believe they're genuine, or do we think, because Putin's very good at talking, but he uses that as a distraction?
So look, we have been at war with Putin for 8 years. So I can tell you that all his promises are not worthy, even the paper that they are written on. Even more, I can tell you definitely, when Putin is telling you, we want peace, this means gather all your troops because we are going to attack. When Putin says, we are withdrawing our troops, this means we are regrouping to attack you. If Putin says, it is not our troops, it means it is our troops and we are going to attack you. This is like, I can tell you like a bazillion of proofs for the last 8 years how it happened. So there is no way there will be like the peace negotiations will lead anywhere. Putin needs a couple of days to regroup. We kind of honestly could use a couple of days to regroup, especially with the sanctions. His situation is worse and time is playing on our side. So as of right now, here's what I would say. I don't believe in these negotiations, but I'm fine that they are going. Putin did not expect what he found in Ukraine. So his soldiers were very badly equipped and they didn't have any supplies. So it was just, they thought that they would come and be greeted as liberators. And that was very weird for me as a manager, but okay, let's imagine that he thought that it will be a blitzkrieg. But right now, after a brave Ukrainian nation kicked his behind.
You can say whatever you want.
Yeah, his ass. Yeah, well, I don't believe that he will be like continuing on the same strategy. So that's why they lost 4,000 people right now, which is also a lot even for Russia. And especially like the rate is very, high just for like a regular war rate. And I believe that he will be regrouping. He needs time for that. So nothing personal, just war business. Let's call it this way.
So how does this end? How does this conflict come to? Because a lot of people are saying that Putin, obviously the invasion's gone badly for Russia. But will he become more desperate? Will he become more brutal? So how does this end? What's the end game?
So let's go from like the most negative scenario, because all the members today were asking me that. First of all, like everybody is afraid that he will turn on the nuclear thing. I don't believe in like in mass nuclear destruction. I believe in some tactical things where he would show that he means business. And then we'll ask for the negotiation. This is number one. I think the chances are less than 10%. Number two, NATO comes in, says, okay, we are backing Ukraine, backing Ukraine. Then Putin said, oh, this is third world war. NATO says, no, it's not. Putin says, no, it is. All that thing. Also less than 20% chance. Plus, for Putin to say, oh, this is third world war, he needs to have like army to fight. And I don't think that he will have that. And the third one is Russia. This is isolated or disassembled. I know that right now it sounds a little bit crazy from my side, but this is the idea of them to go to default. Mm-hmm. So, and this is what we are aiming for. And this is honestly what I'm fighting for. So I know that I have to buy some time. So Russian economy collapse. Russian people start creating process inside the country. Dollar versus ruble trade like 300 rubles, which will be terrible. People cannot take money from banks because they are sanctioned. His friends oligarchs are super pissed off because their children have to come back from London and Miami to Sochi, and they don't like it because they had also their plans. And Putin so there is a change of power in Russia, and Russia becomes either super isolated like North Korea or something, and then has no deal to threat anybody, or there is a change of power there. So it's two things: or Russia disassembles to like a smaller republics, because from what I know and the discussions have been there, that these movements do exist there. So that's these are the plans, if you ask me.
So it's almost as if you guys need to hold out, get as much help as possible until the sanctions cripple Russia to such an extent that they have to then turn back and not only leave, but also huge changes within Russia itself.
Right, and that's why what was so important for Russian and for sanctions to be implemented so early.
There's been
and not like at the last day, oh, the war started, let's implement sanctions. No, we said that the war would start anyway.
So there's a lot of talk about, particularly in Britain, about how Britain has a lot of Russian money goes into Britain, and in particular London. What would you like to see Britain do above and beyond just what the EU, because the EU has been very quick and very strict, but Britain has been a little bit behind. What would you like to see the British government do?
Well, first of all, and I have been talking to many of you generals, and we have different opinions, obviously, is on the no-fly zone, because I know that Britain can provide that, and even without even on like a just British level. So we have met with the head of the Defense Committee of the British Parliament, Tobias Elwood, who supported my party's idea that we planned like 3 months ago, provide us with the no-fly zone. And there are means to do it without saying, oh, we done it. So I don't see why Britain can say same way as Russia says, it's not our troops, saying it's not our rockets.
Mm.
Well, and then go to Gaga and then try to figure it out, right? So this is the first thing. This is the most important thing. If there is only one thing that I could ask for the world, is like provide a no-fly zone. The rest, we will kill them ourselves. And then second thing is their personal sanctions to like a huge amount of Russian oligarchs, pro-Putin oligarchs, because this really pisses them off, because they're saying, oh, this is your war, you are fighting it, okay, we're fine. But like, why do our children have to come back from London?
Mm. Yeah.
Well, and grandchildren. So I know that it's all unpleasant things to do for especially for the United Kingdom, where really lots of Russian money flowing in. But this is like this is what you have to do. Otherwise, Ukraine will fail, then Poland will fail, then Baltic countries will fail, and then we'll see like what happens.
So, I mean, just going what you've just said there, I mean, some of the comments you've just made now, it seems almost unbelievable. You're talking about, you know, killing soldiers. You said, I think you said before, there's a 1 in 10 chance you believe they might use some sort of nuclear weapon on Ukraine. How will this change Ukraine? I mean, how will this change you going forward? What is the next place? Where do we get back to where we were?
I don't think there is a. So look, let me start from something like different to explain what's going on. For the last 5 days, we had to accept that our generation failed our children, because we really hoped, you know, like after Soviet Union collapsed, we really hope that we will raise a generation that doesn't know what the war is, and that doesn't know like all these poverty things, etc. So I survived it, and I promised myself that I will never ever let the next generation go through what I've gone, like when there was no food, etc., etc. And now, after all this struggle, after trying to make money, now we have a new generation who knows now to hold on to your small backpack and not leave it at any purpose, because there's a backpack with the documents. The new generation that had to learn and to repeat their blood type, and new generation that like knows like all these things that they will never go away. These are the changes that happening to children that will never go away. And this is like, when I'm looking at this, then you're thinking the change, the nuclear, etc. It's all like secondary, because what happens with the country would be secondary to what happens to this new generation that being screwed right now. Every single day they have to go to the bomb shelter. They have to lay down on their bellies and do the turtle thing. I told it, I think on all the TV channels, the turtle thing, but this is like what you have to develop to protect the mental health of your children. And this is what crazy. The rest we will deal with. We are adults. We need to, it's like, it's our obligation. And you know what is the most scary thing is when you think that there are grown-ups in the room and suddenly it's you, the grown-up in the room, and you're making the decision for all the country, etc. But this, everything else is easy for me to process. This is hard.
So people across the UK, from Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, Wales, every corner of the UK, want to do something to help Ukraine. This is on every news channel, every social media site, everything. This has really struck with the British people. What would you like them to do? On an individual level, what would you like the British people to do?
Push your government to provide a no-fly zone. This is the main thing. This is like, if you send medical aid to Ukraine, I will appreciate and write you a personal message of thanks. If you would send money, it will also help, and it will also be great help. But honestly, we cannot buy Air Force security using this money. And even if the food or medical aid allows us to survive another day, it will not be the change that we require. So the thing that we need right now, really, like petition or a protest or something which would say, like, with any means, go to Ukraine and provide a no-fly zone over it. So if the rockets stop shelling our cities, it's easier to fight, it's less stress, and then the kids wouldn't have to go to the bomb shelters. Like, as simple as it is. And this is what we need. And this is what we cannot build ourselves, though we really, really want it.
So there are tens of thousands of Ukrainians that live in the UK right now. Do you believe that more people from your country will want to come to the UK as a place where they can be safe? Or do you think that people fleeing from the war may stay in the countries that border the Ukraine?
look, for many people right now, what's happening is a shock. Because I was asking them, like, you are fleeing to Europe for what? What are you going to do there, especially with the small kids? Like, the shock will pass, but what are you going to be doing there? Like, it's like a totally new life that you are starting when you're not ready to that. So I believe that there will be many people in the border of Ukraine who actually will go through the initial shock, and then we'll figure it out. But I don't think that there will be too many people going right to the United Kingdom.
So I also want to get your impression of NATO and the EU and how that's perceived by Ukrainians right now. I heard this morning that there were calls obviously for, like you just mentioned earlier, about becoming a member of the EU quickly, if possible. Do you think that's something that cross Ukraine that is going to be pushed for quite strongly? Well,
we learned something during the last 8 years when we had war with Russia on our eastern borders, is when you have an opportunity, you have to push for it. So we would be right now pushing hard as possible to get into EU, to get like membership of NATO, or at least plan for the membership of NATO, to get Russia out of everywhere where it was like standing. So because when the situation arises, a week before war, I was at Munich security conference where were all the partners from all the countries and all the generals, etc. And they were all tapping me on the back and saying, yeah, if something happens, we will, just let him attack and we will give you all the support that you need. Yeah, we will give you the military support, etc. But now I know that it is like either you're in or you are out. And we really want to be in. And we really want to push to be in. And we will do like whatever possible on our diplomatic side to actually get everywhere, like get the best of the situation, just because the future is so unpredictable.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. You said you had 20 minutes, so thank you so much for coming on. And I hope one day I will get to visit your beautiful country, once this is all over, I hope you'll think about coming back on the podcast and coming to speak to our viewers again, because I think I'm listening to this and I'm of a similar age to yourself. I'm a couple of years older. This is something my generation has never really had to deal with. And I'm getting quite emotional listening to you speak. So all I can just say on behalf of all of us is please stay safe. Please look after yourselves, and I hope this ends as quickly as possible, and just good luck and please be safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the help and support. Thank you so much for talking to me. And I really do hope that next time you will be talking, it will be a boring talk, because I will be telling you all my plans on rebuilding the country. And you will be saying, yeah, well, maybe talk about your personal stuff. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.
All the best.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Rains. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetor Rains have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetor Rains are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetor Rains website at praetorrains.co.uk/liberal-democrats. And that was our interview with Kira. We just want to say thank you so much to Kira for coming on the podcast, and I'm sure all the rest of the panel I'm almost in a little bit of shock. I'm sorry to say, the things that she's having to go through. Like I said, she was a trained IT worker who then managed a company that's now picking up a machine gun to defend her country. It's astonishing. Laurie, what were your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly powerful interview, and I think we're all a little bit, well, I don't know, it feels a bit crass to say that we're all a bit shell-shocked from it, but I think that's how I feel. And I think it's certainly given us a lot to think about, but it does just go to show quite how profound the change has been. But also, I think the point that she was making, which I think was quite well taken, was around how late some of these sanctions have been and how complacent a lot of countries have been in the run up to this, thinking about the Russian money that's been sloshing around. In this country, we had the Russian report into election interference, which was delayed and then not released in full. So, this has been an issue for a long time. And I think we have to be thinking not only what do we do now, but also what mistakes have we made in the run up to this, and how can we make sure that we don't make similar mistakes again, thinking about sort of other situations where sort of we're dealing with autocratic governments that are trying to influence our democracies.
I should just point out, so I've been very remiss. I've completely forgot to introduce our panel to our listeners. So we've got our regular panel. So we've just heard from Laura Gordon, who is our Sheffield Hallam parliamentary candidate. We've also got Sam Al-Hamdani and David McKenzie as well on today's show. So David, following on from that, what were your thoughts about what we've just heard?
Tragic, just utterly tragic that anybody in the world should have to go through that today, especially, I think the piece that she spoke about, the horrors that young children will now face and the after effect that those children will have to deal with for the rest of their lives and the mental health implications. I mean, war does not end after the final shot is fired. There is going to be a casualty amount post this that is not just equated to loss of life. It's about how it affects the country going forward. And I think you rightly said, to have somebody who now is in a position where, you have to take up arms to defend your country. And let's be clear, I've been in the position where I'm quite benefited in that I've been in cadets and I've fired machine guns, etc. before. It's not an easy thing to do, and it doesn't, you can't do it overnight and learn it. So you're asking men, women, and children with no experience to go out and fight an army that is trained to do this. It's just unfathomable, and I really hope we do more to help these people, because it's absolutely morally right that we do that.
And I suppose, Sam, the thing I just leaned on from what David just said about, she was very thinking about, I will kill them. They come to my job is now to kill them. And to take someone's life, even in the most noble of causes, changes people. It changes societies. I couldn't, and I was, that's when I started to struggle. I thought that whatever her life was, has changed, and it will never be the same again.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone listening to this will, well, maybe some people have been in the army, but to have that idea of, like, we cannot properly conceive of how that will change you. It's just not possible. And for all the empathy we can feel, like, her life is already changed. Her way of thinking is now changed forever. Before she even gets to the point of firing a shot in anger, if it comes to that, and that's going to be true of millions of people across that country, and actually broader than that. The number of people I worked in Geneva, and I know, so I've got friends from all across Eastern Europe, and the number of people who I've spoken to or heard from who are scared that is next, and so they're having to change their mindsets and trying to reassess what that means for not just themselves but their families. It's terrifying.
So let's kind of move on a little bit into what we think the ramifications of all this might be. I mean, there's a million topics we could go into, and no doubt this is going to be a news story for the next decade, maybe beyond, or the fallout from this. And again, I don't mean to use the word fallout in terms of, I mean, the fact she said, she believes there's a 10% chance Russia might use a nuclear weapon on Ukrainian soil is, again,
terrifying.
It's terrifying, and it actually, it's one of those things that's come back to me, because I remember in parliamentary selections and parliamentary hustings and internal debates about nuclear weapons and the party's kind of stance on it. And this is the first time in my life, because I remember thinking, I'm not either do away with Trident or absolutely renew it. I was very much on the fence, and so I didn't know if we'd ever use it. But when this happens, having the nuclear deterrent, does anyone think we should scrap the Trident missile defense system now?
Well, can I just speak very quickly on this, because obviously in 2014 this was something that came up regularly, and we were laughed out the room when suggestions were made about, the reason we have Trident is to stop aggression from countries like Russia. I think that's been proven right now. And Ukraine, obviously, as a nation, does not have a nuclear deterrent. And I think Russia would seriously have considered what they were doing if it did. Mm-hmm. And I think in the world that we're living in now, I would love to live in a world where nuclear weapons were not necessary. We did not have to have them. But I think we must now seriously consider what the implications are, and if having a deterrent is obviously the correct thing to do to keep our nation and also the world safe.
But I think this also highlights quite why nuclear weapons are quite so dangerous, and quite why how they poison the entire international system. I think the challenge that we have at the moment for Ukraine is that Western countries are limited in how they can support Ukraine for lots of reasons, but the biggest one being that we don't want to accidentally drift into a nuclear war. And actually the fact that we now have to start thinking about, if we want to bring this to a peaceful conclusion where as few people as possible lose their lives, and avoiding the kinds of destruction that we've seen in places like Syria and in Grozny, where Russian wars have reached their sort of full destructive horror, we have to start thinking, well, what does Putin want, and how can we give him an off-ramp? And actually that is part of the reason we have to do that, is because they have nuclear weapons. And because, if the EU and NATO have to walk, and the UK and other allies have to walk a very fine line between offering the maximum support to the Ukrainians in their desperate fight to defend themselves, but also not going over the point that will sort of trigger a cornered and isolated and paranoid Vladimir Putin to hit the nuclear button. And so I think it does just show quite how dangerous a nuclear armed world is. And that's not a particularly profound comment, or necessarily one that gives us much indication about what we could or should be doing about it. But I think it does throw into relief the challenge that we have, which is how do we find a solution that respects everything that the Ukrainians deserve and want from their fight for their nationhood, but also gives Vladimir Putin enough to be able to save enough face to withdraw without upping the ante, which I fear is what will happen if he is not given that opportunity.
Sam?
Well, anytime we have a nuclear deterrent, that is a failure. But we're not always in control of that failure. As long as Russia has a political system where Putin can stay in control and can drive this, it's a very long process for us to, we can't tell Russia what to do. We can only try and create a situation where Russia brings the change that would get rid of that nuclear arsenal. But as long as that's the case, it's not us that we can resist that.
Yeah, no, sorry. To be honest, I don't think I don't think that there's much that we can do about the situation. It's just it does throw into relief the challenge that we have in trying to find a way out of this nightmare. And the focus, of course, has to be on supporting the Ukrainians, and has to be on making sure that they are not sort of overrun by Putin's armies. But we also need to find a way out that that does hopefully prevent an escalation, because I do fear that if we aren't able to do that, then we'll start seeing the use of thermobaric weapons. We've already seen cluster munitions used against a kindergarten, things like that increasing, and just a level of human suffering and carnage that we've seen already in Syria, already in Grozny, and that I fear may come to Ukraine if we can't find a way out.
The other thing we need to consider as well is the difficulty of what happens, if there is any sort of aftermath with Vladimir Putin, because I don't think people in this country realize how difficult it would be to remove Vladimir Putin from power by the Russian people. I had the opportunity to interview what was supposedly a alternative party within Russia, who straight up said that the only way to get elected in Russia is to be a member of the United Russia Party, which was obviously founded by Vladimir Putin. There is no opposition within Russia, and that's from both national and state dumas, which is obviously the parliaments and the sort of state councils of Russia. He has his tentacles throughout the whole of government within Russia. He has obviously done certain things that will make this more palatable to some Russians. You'll see he's deployed Chechnyan forces, which Russian people don't really care that much about. Not to make grand sweeping statements, but that's the reason he's done it. This is going to be very, very difficult, and I don't know what Russia looks like once this is over, if it is over.
And I think there is a thing in Russia. So talking to a friend of mine from St. Petersburg, and her, she's got parents who are in their 80s, and she lives in sort of Western Europe and is sort of very westernized. But I asked her about her family, and they have only ever lived under kind of dominant, almost imperial leaders in Russia. And it's entrenched in, she said it's basically just part of their psyche. They expect their leaders to behave like this. And actually, it would be unpopular to have a leader who wasn't like this. Now, obviously, we're seeing protests in Russia. It's not a universal thing. But it's, there is a really entrenched thing in the psyche of this is what leaders are supposed to be like. And for many people, that reinforces Putin's power because it does make him popular.
I don't think I agree with that, actually. I mean, I think these things often seem true until they're not. And I think, if you look at somewhere like Belarus, where, they've got a similar record of autocratic leadership, and then in the election, they elected the sort of polar opposite of that. They elected the fact that the dictator Lukashenko was able to stay in power through extreme repression. I don't think changes the fact that actually the people of Belarus did express a different view. And I don't think, I think, Russia is obviously a long way behind that, but actually maybe it isn't, maybe actually, there will be a time where it just kind of turns. And I think these things, and, we've seen this in all kinds of countries that, these things look like they can't change until they do. And I think the point has to be around how do you support that when the opportunity comes, and I think that will be an ongoing challenge, especially in places like Belarus, where Lukashenko has been able to stay in power, but where people are continuing to protest, and where actually the crisis in Ukraine does seem to have revitalized the protest movement.
I want to move a little bit because I went to Russia back in 2005, and the change from Putin there. Putin's always been a thug and a tyrant. There's no way you could think of him as a Western kind of modern leader. But actually, the changing his mindset and that state of mind seems to have completely shifted. Now, I don't know if this is just a hard man leader. The only thing he can do is go even more crazy, or whether there's something psychologically has changed. Because that rant about the supposed history of Ukraine was completely, I was not to say deranged, but it was not far off.
Unhinged.
Yeah, unhinged. That's exactly the word I was thinking of. It was. And Putin's mistake now, I wonder if this is a colossal misstep for actually, because he spent decades undermining kind of Western democracies. And this seems to have done the entire opposite in terms of actually regalvanizing. Germany suddenly has a foreign policy, and Scholz has announced just yesterday about greater funding for the arms. Switzerland and Sweden ending, their tradition of neutrality completely. If there's a way of actually galvanizing the West, which probably needed it in the light of what's happened in terms of Brexit and Trump and everything else, this is probably the greatest misstep that Putin could have ever done, and maybe one of the better things for Western democracies in Europe.
Yeah, I was going to just pick up on that, because I think there's a couple of things. We're talking about him being unhinged. 22 years in power, either as president of Russia or as prime minister. There's expectations that he's become increasingly isolated during this pandemic period. He has reduced the number of people around him who might have an opposing view or might be able to talk him round in terms of, really, that's not what we should be doing. There was, and apologies, I don't have this in front of me, but there was a French psychologist who I believe was part of Macron's delegation to Russia, who met Vladimir Putin pre-pandemic, and obviously during this pandemic when they went to negotiate with him. And his view was that this is a person who's becoming increasingly paranoid and isolated from any opposing voices. But let's be clear, I made this point of, as the West, we kind of have to take some responsibility that we've allowed this to fester, because this is a person who has presided over human rights abuses in his own country. He has actively gone into other nations like the UK twice and is actively engaged in poisonings. And what was the repercussions? Absolutely nothing. And then when we did come to the first wave of sanctions, it was pathetic and emboldened that nation to go, well, you know what are the real sanctions that are going to be put on our nation if we do this? And, it's too little too late. And I think we need to really look at this, take learnings from it, because, Vladimir Putin is not the only authoritarian dictator leader in the world. And there's ones that are within the EU. I'm thinking of Fidesz, that we seriously need to think about what's the way forward and how do we deal with people like that so they don't get to this stage.
Yeah, I have to say that's been one of my thoughts as well. As less so about, didn't go Fidesz. I was thinking more about Saudi Arabia and the war that they're waging in Yemen, where again, there's a lot of Saudi money sloshing around, and what are we going to do about it? We've seen how quickly that when we want to impose sanctions, we actually can do it quickly. But actually, should we be doing that more widely to some of these other countries? And sort of Saudi might be one example, but actually, also, for example, the dictatorship in Myanmar. There will be, and so many more. But I also think we do need to start being honest with ourselves about what the cost of this is going to be in the UK as well. Especially for ordinary people in the context of the cost of living rise. Now, that doesn't change the fact that these sanctions are the right thing to do. They absolutely are. We absolutely do not have a choice but to do them. And we have to, if they don't hurt us, they aren't going to be working. And we need to be thinking quickly about how we mitigate the impact of that on the most vulnerable, because we're already seeing a cost of living crisis. One of the things I really notice when I go out door knocking nowadays is how many people open the door wearing their coats. And that's before gas, with the gas prices rising, to the level they have already. And if we see them going up further, that's just going to be even more. And so, I think we shouldn't be achieving our international goals on the back of the poorest people in our country. We should be thinking about an emergency uprating of benefits and pensions in order to make sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable from the impacts of that.
Sam, I want you to start us off on talking about, say, the UK reaction to this, because I touched on it a little bit with Kira about, I personally have been pretty disgusted with how the UK government, they seem to be needing to be kicked and screaming to do anything, and when they do, they seem to do it marginally and then have to get shamed again. It's amazing that there is, between FIFA and the British government, seem to be a competition who can be the most useless at dealing with this situation. So what are your thoughts on the UK response?
Well, I think, sort of going off the back of what's just been said, I was working in Berlin 4 years ago when we were putting together a resolution on Russia invading Crimea and Sevastopol. So this is not you can say this is a slow reaction to what's just happened, but there's been 4 years of Russian troops in Ukraine, and it was obvious then, as part of that, without really wanting to go into the whole detail, that this was organized and planned and deliberate, and this was always going to end up at this point. We saw. The Russian delegation walked out of that conference when they were challenged on their behaviour in Crimea. They tried to have the resolution condemning their actions thrown out, and then they stormed out of the conference, having had a full screaming match with the Ukrainian delegation. And 4 years on from that, after the Russian troops go in again, is when we get a half-hearted response, and that's appalling. It really is appalling, and. I know it's difficult to make these decisions.
Shall we just give listeners and viewers what actually is the latest? So Liz Truss, firstly, has said, if people want to go off and fight, go and do it. Interesting enough, Tobias Ellwood, which Kira actually mentioned, has actually said, don't go do that. You'll go get yourself killed. You're probably just going to clog up the system. In regards to refugees, the UK government is saying that the potential, if you have a family member, but only certain types of family members, so it's not even opening.
And only if you're a British citizen, not if you're a Ukrainian citizen who's resident in the UK.
So these really are, and there's no word to really describe it. Meagher doesn't do it justice. It's just cold-hearted, I think, and I'm really interested, Laura and David. I'll let Laura go first. So there's been a lot of rhetoric about the channel crossings, there's pandering to a certain right-wing vote. Priti Patel's kind of dealings with all the stuff regarding the RNLI and everything else. Now, this is actually showing that the vast majority of people in the UK think, actually, let's take some Ukrainian refugees. We have no problem with that whatsoever. And they still don't want to do it. So is this them being dumb? Is it them being incompetent? Or is this actually a very vicious ideology in the central government?
I think it's ideological, to be honest. I think it is important to be fair, though, and I think it is worth saying that there are some things that the government has done right. I think in terms of sending armaments to Ukraine, our government was one of the first and largest contributors, and I think that is something that they do deserve some credit for. And they've also been lobbying, on some of the sanctions around SWIFT, for example. They're one of the governments that was lobbying for actions on SWIFT. So I think we do have to give them some credit. But on this refugees issue, they have been absolutely woeful. And the contrast between some of the public statements, putting out a Wordle meme that looks like a Ukrainian flag while saying we're going to stand with refugees, but like, oh yes, but you can only actually come if you're a child under 18 or a spouse. Like it's just incredibly insulting and doesn't come close to the level of need. But I think you're right to point out that this is not what polling data suggests the public want. The public has been very clearly in favour of accepting Ukrainian refugees. And I think it's important to say that this is flatly un-British. This is not the British way. And we see that because if you ask the British people what they want, they say, yes, we should give people sanctuary. And it is our government that is behaving this way. And I think it is really important to draw that distinction between the government and what people want. And also I think it's easy to then say, oh yes, but people elected this government. It's like, well, yeah, they did, but only because the alternative was Jeremy Corbyn, who's out there with his Stop the War Coalition comments talking about de-escalation and both sidesing it. And I'm sorry, there is no both sidesing it when one party is being invaded by another party and one party is lobbing cluster munitions at kindergarten. You cannot both sides dropping cluster munitions on a kindergarten. You just can't. So I think it is important. I do think it's ideological, but I do think it's also important to draw a distinction between what the people of this country want and what this government is doing, and also sort of why this government is there. And I have to say, looking at how Jeremy Corbyn is behaving at the moment, I can't say I blame people who voted the other way.
David?
Yeah, look, I just really want to echo some of Laura's comments. I think it's absolutely disgusting, the comments that obviously came out about accepting refugees from this crisis. It Just to say again what Laura said, it just seems to me entirely un-British. I mean, we constantly go on about, World War II and this country and how great we are. And what did we do during that war? We accepted who needed to come to this country, the kinder transport. We have, a long history of taking people into this country who are escaping conflict, who, came. I think I gave this example before we started recording. My mother's uncle flew communist Poland because he would have been killed if he had stayed. Nobody batted an eyelid at those people coming to this country then. And now all of a sudden we have a government in place who says, oh, you can only come if you're willing to pick fruit, or if you have a relative who's already living here, then maybe we might consider you coming. It's just entirely un-British. And I just don't see the majority of people in this country echoing that. And I think actually it's a misstep from this government that will come back to bite them.
Do you think, though, I mean, it's worth saying that I think there's also a record of this country of having governments that are much harsher on these issues than the people are. And I think the kindercart transport is a good example. The kindercart transport was a massive and important gesture of humanitarianism by ordinary British people in the face of a government that had decided to keep out Jewish refugees in the 1930s. The reason the kinder transport was necessary was because the government wasn't allowing whole families to come. Nobody should have had to put their kids on one of those trains and never see them again. They should have all been able to come, because our governments have so consistently led. But when you start talking to ordinary people understand that it could be them, and they understand that they need to give people sanctuary when there are these horrible things happening in the world. And the fact that our government has so consistently over generations, our governments have so often been behind people where the people are in terms of that compassion. And I mean, where the government has taken a different view, it's often been a colossal success for this country. If you look at the Ugandan Asians, including Priti Patel's family, the Ugandan Asians were welcomed in by Ted Heath's government and have turned into, have been a sort of phenomenally successful group. They've done very well in this country and have contributed enormously to this country's growth and development over the intervening period. And it just shows how wrong it is on just every level, and how when we take a different approach, it just works for so much better for everyone, as well as being obviously and most importantly the right thing to do. But I do think we need to think as well about refugees, not just from the Ukraine, but other victims of Putin's wars, because the fact is that people from Syria have been displaced for a decade now. Still there is still very little international effort to resolve that situation with sort of any kind of what at this point would likely need to be a massive internationally coordinated resettlement program. And that really is what we need, because the reality is that once the average time that a refugee is displaced for is 18 years. And obviously, we hope that most of these people will be going home soon, but many of them won't be, and they need and deserve a long-term solution that allows them to have and grow their own future.
Sam?
Yeah, it frightens me. I talked about how when I was working in Berlin, and one of the people who was working there and who was one of the strong voices in condemning this is Lord Dubs. And he came to this country as a refugee. And he's now in his 90s, and that's 70, 80 years of public service, trying to remind the government of what its duty should be. And he's the reason why it's the Dubs Amendment. We fight for, in his name, to let children into this country, and it's terrifying that we've had to fight to let children into this country. It was a wonderful speech from Lord Roberts at one of the Northwest conferences, and he talked about why we went into coalition and what a difficult decision it was. And he said the reason why he voted, and it didn't matter about anything else, like he'd spent his life fighting to get children safe into this country. And the choice was, we go into coalition and we can keep children coming into this country with the laws as they are, or if we don't, then the Conservative government has made a promise to scrap that. And he said, I can't put my name in a box which says I'm not letting children into this country. And it is just terrifying that people of that stature have had to spend decades arguing that should even be the case.
So to finish off, guys, this one. So what do you think the repercussions will be for UK politics? So previous to this, obviously, Boris Johnson was having an absolute torrid time with Partygate and everything else. The polling slide. I have a feeling that Boris seems to quite enjoy these telephone statements. That kind of, I am the Churchillian Prime Minister that I've always wanted to be. Now, what do we think will be the political consequences of this? As we know from the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they can move on quite quickly. Can the news agenda can move on. So lasting impressions from this. We'll start with you, Sam, actually, this time.
I mean, I think, to be honest, all the Partygate stuff is gone, really, because nobody's talking about it and nobody's thinking about it. And probably that police report is going to come out while this is going on and everyone's attention will be elsewhere. And I think a lot of it now comes down to he does like that idea of being a Churchillian leader, but he's not. And his competence or his incompetence is likely to be shown up by this. And the difficulty we had before all that Partygate stuff kind of came in was he was getting away with incompetence. It was just sliding off him. And it does remain to be seen. I think he will prove to be incompetent again, but I don't know if that will be picked up by the public in the same way. And it would probably take something specific that sort of something very specifically wrong that really caught public attention for that to have the same impact as what was going on before. So it does worry me that he is going to actually get away with an awful lot of stuff.
Laura.
I mean, I think it's really hard to call because I think this situation is just moving so quickly. And, at the moment, at the time that we're recording, there's the peace talks going on. The Ukrainians have repulsed the attacks. It could be that this all changes very quickly and we get into a kind of prolonged siege type scenario. I mean, it could equally be that that there is a sort of breakthrough. And I mean, I don't think anyone's particularly optimistic of that, but, you can't completely rule it out. So I think at this stage, the situation is just so fast moving that it's really hard to call what the impact could be. I mean, my belief is always that the fundamentals come out in the end. And ultimately, if you are a bad prime minister who is a bad leader, who is fundamentally dishonest and, that will, and, breaks sort of as possibly about to be found to have broken the law, these kind of things do have a tendency to come out in the end. And, I don't think I can pretend any sort of foresight of how the next few months are going to look, but I think those fundamentals will come out in the end.
David.
Just the worst possible leader to have at the worst possible time. Latest polls suggest that the Conservatives would lose all their seats in Scotland and Wales at the next general election, and I don't see anything changing as a result of what they're doing in this crisis. I think, Sam pointed out he does like to think of himself as a Churchillian leader. Obviously, he wrote a biography of Winston Churchill. The thing I would say is, I know a lot of people will have differing views on Winston Churchill, and I completely appreciate that man is not the finished article that sometimes history makes him out to be. But this Prime Minister is nowhere near that Prime Minister. But what does worry me is I feel that he is the type of person who would make a serious misstep to try and sort of fill those boots, which could lead to some level of escalation. I mean, it's not so long ago, if you remember, he was skirting into what Russia claimed was territorial waters and poking the bear. I would seriously hope that the Prime Minister considers any next move carefully. And anything that he does do is in the best interest of the Ukrainian people, who needs to be our number one priority at this time.
Well said, David. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will call an end to this episode. I want to thank David, Laura and Sam for being on. Obviously, this situation isn't going away anytime soon. We'll keep up to date all our listeners and viewers with everything that's going on, our big takeaways from what's going on, but also other stuff that's going on as well, because it's very easy to forget the detail of what's happening here at home as well, and whether that's the local elections that are coming up, like I say, what's happening in our areas, what's happening in our news. And we talked about the Russian protests. Well, under the new rules by this government, we would not be allowed to do those protests either in Britain. So we have lots of fights both in our own shores as well. But like I say, I want to thank particularly Kira for coming on today. I mean, it's just unimaginable what she's having to deal with. But whatever else happens, we will have the podcast come back to you as often as possible. And I want to thank these guys for being here with me today. And if you want to follow anything to do with the Lib Dem Podcast, you can at Lib Dem Pod on all social media. You can subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. And thank you very much to those people that do throw us a little bit of money on our Patreon account just to keep the podcast going. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much for listening, folks. I know that was quite a long one, but we really appreciate it. And we'll be back with another episode very soon.